Hello, colleagues. I want to ask you a question. Does it make sense to say that empty space exists? You might think that pure emptiness is nothing, so of course it doesn't exist. But what if we put that emptiness in a box, like a room, in downtown Vancouver? Now the space is finite, and we're very cognizant of how much space there is or exists. Folk wisdom said that the space didn't exist, but a developer might begin from a very different place. Ontology studies problems like that one of mine. It's the philosophical study of existence, and this week, we're exploring the curious ontological turn in anthropology. Now, conventional anthropology assumes there's one objective world, like this, and that humans collectively interpret that world. We do that in the form of culture. The ontological turn questioned this assumption of one reality, and not in some weird, spooky way. It did this as a practical, methodological demand for anthropological fieldwork, as you'll see. So with that, we'll turn to my astute collaborator, Raha Parnia.
So, anthropology had most commonly explained why one group of people differed from another by pointing to culture, shared ideas, values, practices, and etc. For instance, Canadians often greet with a handshake, while the often Japanese bow. Anthropology traditionally contributed this difference to culture. It assumed there is one objective, physical reality that includes the same land, sea, animals, and etc. Each culture just views this common reality differently. As Heywood writes on page 2, worlds as well as worldviews may vary. Ontological anthropologists claim that anthropology had sneakily implied a single uniform reality's existence. This reinforced the distinction between nature and culture. If an anthropologist had tried to use the concept of a nature-culture dichotomy to explain the life of the Hogan peoples of Papua New Guinea, it would be circular. It would be like insisting that all human societies must divide the world into objective facts and group perspective. The Hogan don't do this. They still have a perspective, but it's just having no perspective. Meanwhile, Eduardo Viveros de Castro work with Amazonian groups shows that they treat every being, like humans, animals, and spirits, as sharing one perspective, while their bodies occupy different worlds. Hence, anthropology, insisting upon the nature-cultural dichotomy, says nothing about these cases. Bruno Letter observes that scholars often start by putting things into two categories: nature, for supposedly objective stuff like rocks and storms, and society for human affairs like markets and laws. He calls that permanently sorting or purification. Ontological anthropologists don't make that move. For them, pre-sorting, what counts as natural or social, is a result of fieldwork or anthropography, not its starting point. In fact, ontological anthropologists keep all preformed concepts and rules provisional except one. You should have no prior commitments apart from that field data can rewrite your concept. This is called recursivity. Now, concepts can be fine, but ontological anthropologists expect findings to push back and modify concepts. The influence between theory and evidence is a two-way street. Philip the scholar labors worldviews as modes of identification like animism or naturalism. Ontological anthropologists distance themselves from any typology or predetermined categories which sneaks in philosophical baggage.
So, Martin Hallbrad asked Havana's Ifa diviners whether the oracle might ever give a wrong answer. They said it's impossible. The oracle's verdict doesn't describe reality, it becomes reality. Saying you are bewitched, for example, instantly makes your situation one of bewitchment, like a judge saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife, instantly making being married your reality. Reality, early anthropologists had assumed, is the one real world outside us, and we interpret that one reality with our culture. But calling Ifa practice just another cultural interpretation of reality assumes that a separate, shared reality exists underneath. An ontological anthropologist like Heywood can instead discover truth coming into being spontaneously when the diviner says, you are bewitched. Hence, the ontological anthropologist doesn't impose their conceptual baggage like the nature-culture split to explain what happens. The underlying logic stays inside the Ifa's thought system. Notice that the ontological anthropologist comes having suspended judgment about fundamental ideas. They hear the diviner say that the oracle is never wrong. Instead of dismissing the statement as mere belief, the ethnographer asks what truth must look like for the claim to make sense. Crucially, the anthropologist lets the data reconfigure their underlying concepts. This is called recursivity, a key methodological commitment of ontological anthropology. Okay, let's get into 4 problems with ontological anthropology according to Heywood. First, there's a contradiction. Supporters approach field sites without predetermined categories. However, the rule to have no a priori commitments, or abstract rules, is itself an abstract rule. Second, what looks like radical openness often funnels researchers toward the same circle of continental philosophers, above all Deleuze, and they offer strikingly similar claims. If recursivity truly allowed any conceptual outcome, then we should see a far wider range of conclusions. Third, indigenous scholars worry that the fascination with exotic ontologies can distract attention away from urgent material struggles. Bessiere and Bond argue that celebrating other ways of being can overshadow fights over land theft, climate change, and economic exploitation. Finally, there is a problem of selective hearing. People often disagree about fundamentals, including Cuban diviners disagreeing with one another. When an anthropologist builds a grand ontological claim only on one group's perspective, they elevate that group's view as authoritative. So, Heywood shows us that the ontological turn is far from perfect. If we follow Heywood's line of thought, we might notice that the nature versus culture split feels like common sense because everyday life teaches it to us. Schools sort knowledge into science and social studies, so we learn early that rocks belong to one kind of reality while rules belong to another. News outlets reinforce the lesson by labeling earthquakes as natural disasters and wars as man-made crises. After years, the divide seems self-evident. But ontological anthropology lets us see that others follow very different systems. Ifa diviners hold that an oracle's words do not merely report facts, they bring them into being. When an oracle states, "You are bewitched," that becomes real and reorganizes social life, just as a judge saying, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," spontaneously creates a marriage in law. Some Papua New Guinean communities go further. They use no terms that match our ideas of nature or culture at all. To understand such things accurately, we must grasp different philosophical assumptions instead of forcing the nature-culture split onto them. Seeing culture operate without our familiar split unsettles our habits of thought. We usually treat the divide like gravity, so we never question it. Watching an oracle or a judge create reality with words shows, however, that our mental categories of nature and culture are choices, not physical laws. The same insight surfaces at home when legal sentences or property deeds instantly change people's status. Speech, under the right conditions, makes worlds. When we see that the line between nature and culture is something invented, not a built-in feature of the universe, we realize our deepest starting point is just one option among many. Our worldview begins with the idea that lifeless matter and fixed laws sit beneath everything. Other groups often start somewhere else. For instance, some strands of Buddhism start with mind rather than matter. Everything we see, trees, people, buildings, appears inside of consciousness. Matter is a mental display. By seeing other ways of carving up reality, we better notice what our own worldview overlooks. That is intellectual humility in action. Whether empty space exists depends on the lens you start with. For physics, even a vacuum brims with quantum fields, so empty space exists. In everyday thought, empty means no objects, so nothing exists. Anthropology's ontological turn asks us to notice those starting points. By pausing our instinct to split the world into hard nature and soft culture, we describe other societies more accurately and see our own categories as just one worldview. This is valuable for anyone trying to understand how humans shape and are shaped by the worlds they inhabit.